All right, why don't we get started for the next panel, ladies and gentlemen? Again, my name is Jack Balasia, Executive Director of the KBH Energy Center. Our next panel, if you don't think energy security is vital to the defense of the nation, then you've been living under a rock for a long time, because it is absolutely critical. You need only go back to the Russian invasion of Ukraine just a few years ago for proof of this proposition. Energy can define a nation's security. We have a great panel this afternoon on the current geopolitics of energy security. Let me quickly introduce them and ask them to come up on the stage. First of all, our own Senator Kay Bailey Hutchison, former U.S. Senator and Ambassador to NATO. George See., the founder and chairman of Annandale Capital. Will Van Loo, founder and CEO of Quantum Capital Group. And Paul Edgar, who is our moderator, who is the Associate Director of the Clements Center here on the University of Texas campus, the Clements Center for National Security. So with that, Paul, I'm going to turn it over to you.
Great, thank you. Well, thanks for letting us participate. Thank you all for putting on this conference. Thank you all for attending in what is, other than air and water, is the most important thing domestically and internationally. So thanks for this. Thanks for the opportunity to participate. I was joking with George yesterday because in some ways this is a very intimidating panel to moderate because of the competence and experience up here. But in some ways it's also a very easy panel to moderate because I can just throw out whatever question I want, and they're all so polished and practiced at this sort of thing that they'll ignore what I said, pose the question that actually I ought to have asked, and proceed to answer it. But let's go ahead and get started. And while the title of this is the current geopolitics, we'll start, the first set of questions will really be a little bit historical or maybe retrospective, a little bit of history, reflecting over the last few years or few decades. And Senator Hutchison, we'll start with you, of course. You've served for decades in senior policy roles where you've had a really unique perspective on energy and national security. So in your experience, what are some of the more profound ways that energy and U.S. national security, but also we could say international collective security, how do those things influence one another? What are the things that most of us probably miss because we are so used to, for good reason, we're so used to thinking of energy in all of its forms as something that's very local and domestic?
Well, the first thing that comes to mind is right now, today, we are talking about AI in its infancy, and the statistics show that if you do a Google search, it uses X amount of electricity energy, but if you do the same search through AI, it's 10 times more energy required to get to that answer. So now we're talking about sufficient energy supply, and what that is going to mean as we are looking at wars that are going to be fought on technology now. And we've got to be in the forefront. So right. Energy security is being on top of the technology and getting AI and having the sources. But then, you talk about the modern problems that we have, and just think of the basics of, first of all of our military installations have to have resilient energy. You can't have a nuclear sub that runs out of nuclear. You can't have an airplane that runs out of fuel. You can't have a base where the lights go out when you have a drone hit. And I think of the most graphic, simple lesson that was ever learned that was really based on energy is when Vladimir Putin's tanks ran out of gas and he didn't even have the supply and they lost Kyiv. They might have taken over all of Ukraine if they'd had the gasoline for the tanks to keep going into Kyiv. And when they didn't, and when they faltered and it gave Ukraine a chance to build up the defenses. That's why this war has been able to be prolonged by Ukraine. And that's just a simple fact that was based on a lack of preparation and knowing that you had the secure gas to finish the project.
And while I'd add that while American logistics are best in class and have been for a long time, we should never be presumptuous that we'll stay there, especially as civilian markets lean towards efficiency, while an army doesn't necessarily lean towards efficiency, it leans towards effectiveness. They don't necessarily match.
And resilience. I mean, you've got to have energy first and foremost that lasts, that will not fail when you need it the most.
Right. Well, why don't we turn to you? You've got 3 decades or more in funding energy production, and you know the business as thoroughly as anybody. And you've witnessed and participated in some of the most consequential changes in the market in your professional experience. Can you share a couple things with us? Number one, thinking internationally, what are the changes you've seen in the business or the market over the last 30 years? And what have those changes meant for American foreign policy more broadly, whether it's defense particularly or foreign policy in a broader sense? Why don't we stop there, and then I'll kind of pose the second half after you answer.
Sure. So, I think probably the most significant thing that's happened globally in energy over the last 20, 25 years is the U.S. shale revolution. If you go back to 2006, the United States was the largest importer of oil in the world. We imported about 13 million barrels a day of oil, okay? Which, interestingly enough, is about where China is today. They import about 11.5, 12 million barrels of oil today. And we were building LNG import terminals, not export, but import terminals at this point in time. Oil, if you think about it, in 1998 kind of bottomed out at around $10 a barrel. Gas at about $1.50 per MMBTU. By the time the shale revolution started to take off in the mid to late 2000s, oil was close to $150 a barrel. Gas was close to $15 MMBTU. So oil had gone up about 15-fold, gas had gone up about 10-fold. And the United States was sending $350 to $400 billion a year overseas to countries that quite frankly didn't like us very much. And that's really scary, right? We were funding Iran, Iraq, Russia, and Venezuela. So countries that really had no American interest or values or principles at heart. Fast forward to today, the U.S. is now the largest producer of oil globally because of the shale revolution. We're the largest producer of natural gas globally. We're the largest exporter of natural gas in the world, and we're one of the top 3 largest exporters of petroleum liquid products in the world today. Unbelievable turnaround. And so I would say that's the most consequential event in energy in the last really probably 50 years. And the issue is I think we've gotten a little bit hooked on the easy street of shale, and we have to understand that, in particular in the oil side, that is kind of that growth is coming to an end. And so, but that's what I think is probably the most significant change.
The follow-on piece to that question then is that provided us with a lot of leverage, political leverage, economic leverage. How have we used that leverage well with respect to foreign policy? What have been the failures or maybe missed opportunities, do you think?
Well, so, and Senator Hutchison can probably way better speak to like some of the things like the Gulf War and all that, but, I was in college, finishing up college when the first Gulf War started, and at least from my perspective, as I've been told, obviously we spent a lot of dollars keeping the world safe, keeping oil flowing, we had to, right? Yeah. It was the lifeblood. Energy is the lifeblood of every economy. There is a direct correlation to economies, basically the living standards of a country's people, and the amount of energy it has access to, how secure it is, and how cheap it is. And so we spent a lot of money. We fought wars. We spent a lot of money in foreign military operations, obviously, to preserve. I mean, you go back to the Arab oil embargo, right? And you think about what that did to the United States. I was a very little child at that time, but so I don't really remember it. But my parents told me it was a really tough time. And but that is that's vulnerability, right? And so I think what America has done reasonably well. Now, we took a big step backwards in the last administration on this, but we've utilized that energy independence in pretty significant ways. One, we now have a massive surplus of economic activity that's staying in America. I mean, just the dollars, the trade deficits, and I know this. We launched a trade war yesterday, and so it's a pretty interesting topic to talk about. But you know, if you think about our trade deficits being $1.3 trillion or so last year, I mean, 400 billion of that used to be energy. Think about that. So I think we've done a good job. We've kept those dollars at home. The taxes that have been generated, you know, we ran some numbers a few years ago for our investors. And if you just look at what oil prices, if oil prices would have not been 150, which is where they were before the shale boom, but let's just say they would have averaged $100 a barrel if the shale boom wouldn't have happened. And gas would have averaged just what it has been globally, which is about $10 MMBTU. The world would have spent $25 trillion more on energy since the great financial crisis in 08 than it did. So and in America, it was about a quarter of that. So about $6 trillion is what that saved American consumers. So I think we've used it well in the sense of we've benefited from the prosperity.
Right.
And I think we were really starting to try to use it well in terms of being an energy export powerhouse, and particularly with LNG. And of course, the Biden administration did everything they could to stop that, particularly with the pause that they put on LNG in this last year. But I think that both sides of the aisle do really understand and have that energy is an incredible strategic asset. And I think we've never really been in that position of having energy in excess like we have the last few years. So I think we're still learning as a country how to use energy as kind of a superpower weapon, but it's an incredible weapon to have in our arsenal.
Great, thanks. George, we'll turn to you, and I'll preface this by saying probably have 3 or 4 friends or mentors, and George is in that category.
That's because I'm 20 years older than you are. That's why you call me a mentor.
Who I categorize them like this, that they don't have PhDs in history, but they might as well. They're so well educated and have such powerful historical sensibilities.
Do I owe you money? That's just too nice.
So I pose this historical question to you, George. Can you talk to us about your sort of your personal historical observations on the connections between energy, foreign policy, national security, things that are predictable and unpredictable?
Thank you. That's a great question. And a few preliminaries before I get into that. First, they say never let them see you sweat when you're speaking. And I walked over from the tower today, and there's no way you're going to walk over from the tower in a monkey suit today and not sweat a little bit. So, and I got to do this and say I'm a 4th generation Longhorn with 2 degrees from here, and I love this place very, very much. And 3 of our 6 children are 5th generation Longhorns. So we've really bought into this place. And like so many scores of Texans, I love Senator Hutchison. She is an absolute Texas treasure, and I'm honored to have been your friend for probably around 30 years at this point. Wow, time flies. And Will's been my friend for 20 years, and Paul Edgar's as good as they get, and Joe McGuire, our leader of the Clements Center, is here as well. So it's really nice to be here today. And you look at Will touched on a lot of the points that I know how smart Will is, because he made a lot of points I wanted to make, and he front ran me on them. So I'm going to talk about the history very briefly, which is really fun to talk about, because if you think of World War II, and you think about that our fine fighting men and women won that war and saved us from Nazism and the Japanese at that time. But it wasn't just the outstanding fighting men and women of this country, it was also energy. Our tanks never ran out of gas, our planes never ran out of gas. We had an unlimited amount of energy from the Permian Basin, which really served our country very, very well as we overcame the Nazis. And then you look at the Yom Kippur War, and I have a very personal interaction with that because a relative of mine oversaw the airlift where we resupplied Israel in that critical time when they were on their heels for the first week of that war. People forget that Israel was really getting defeated pretty badly until they turned the tide in the Golan Heights and in the Sinai. And a lot of that was being resupplied by this country, which is the only country in the world which resupplied Israel. But as a consequence of that, the Saudis and the other Arab countries did a boycott and stopped sending us oil. And that led more than anything else to the stagflation of the 70s, where you had a terrible economic malaise that ended with Jimmy Carter talking about this national malaise and Paul Volcker raising interest rates to an unfathomable level today of about 14, 15%. It was a really, really rough time. And the stock market, people forget, over about a decade, returned a real return after inflation of about negative 7% a year. It was really pretty awful. And what I'm getting at with all these kind of things is the staggering soft power of energy. It's the most powerful force in the world from a national security and geopolitical standpoint, and you have to know about it. You have to pay attention to it. So that's why it's so critical we're talking about this today. Two other quick anecdotes. First of all, that the Soviet empire fell because of Reagan's great defense buildup in the 1980s, but also because President Reagan convinced the Saudis to flood the world with 4 million barrels a day of oil that the world didn't need. And it drove the price of oil from $40 a barrel down to $8. And as a consequence, the Soviet Union just cratered, because that's really their only source of economic power, selling a whole bunch of oil. And I have another personal anecdote on this. I was a 19-year-old UT freshman pup travel aide on on the governor's race that year. And we went out to Midland, and my boss gave a speech, and there were about 400 oilmen in the room, and it was like a therapy session in a graveyard, because all those men were bankrupt. So it sounds great that we could use energy as a soft power to take down our enemies globally, like we did with the Soviets in the 1980s, but it's more complicated than that, right? This great state provides so much energy, and if you drive energy down to $30, $40 a barrel, you bankrupt all our energy companies like the Saudis did only about a decade ago. So it's really important for the world's stability for oil to be somewhere in the $60 to $80 a barrel range, and for natural gas to be somewhere in the $2.75 to $4 range. That's where companies can make a lot of money and yet still not be so high that it hurts the consumer radically. So you look at the history of energy just in the last 100 years, and it's just had such an impact on the world, and you have to understand that to understand how important energy is and what a great weapon it is for our country as a soft power.
And as a follow-on to that question, you alluded to him a couple times in your response, but let's bring him to the forefront. Your grandfather, the namesake of the Clements Center for National Security. We'd be remiss if we didn't take a moment to think a little bit further back and consider his life, experiences, and legacy and lessons learned. And like you, he was a PhD in history without a degree. How do you think your grandfather might summarize a lifetime of observations on these things: energy, national security, foreign policy?
I think how he'd look at it, and I knew him very, very, very well, and you talk about how well-read he was. He at one time had the largest library on Texana, all things Texas, in the world, 12,000 volumes that are still in an old school building in downtown Dallas. He called it his library. So if you took him the way he talked Texan, you'd think he just fell off a turnip truck and wasn't all that sharp. But he was one of the smartest, if not the smartest man I ever knew. And he was incredibly well-read. And I think he would say, don't ever underestimate how critical energy is and how important it is for modern society and for the well-being of citizens, not just in this country, but all over the world. And this giant effort to transition us too quickly from fossil fuels to other forms of energy was doomed to failure just because we don't have the technology yet to do that. And secondly, you basically bankrupt dozens of countries around the world and kill off tons of people who rely on energy to heat and cool their homes in the summer and in the winter, and you just can't get away from fossil fuels yet. Should we transition eventually to clean sources of power? Well, of course we should. That'd be great for the world once we get there, but it's going to take several decades. It's going to take a very, very long amount of time, and in the meantime, we're very blessed. In this country, we've got almost an unlimited supply of natural gas that we can liquefy and send around the world due to technological advancements, because it's so much a cleaner fuel source than coal or wood burning or other forms of energy used around the world. And I think I read that Toby Rice said that if the Chinese would convert all their coal plants to natural gas-fired power plants, it would be the exact same effect on the environment as if we electrify the entire U.S. auto fleet now. So it's a staggering amount of improvement we could do around the world if we just use natural gas until we can bridge to a much cleaner future. So I think he would be encouraged, even though he was a drilling contractor and formed the largest oil and gas drilling company in the world. I think he would be all for a transition eventually. It's progress, it's improvement. And his company was always on the cutting edge technology-wise of oil and gas, and technology is what makes the world a better place, and energy is part of that.
Right. Senator Hutchison, thinking about energy as a tool of foreign policy, is there a way that you observed that and were involved with that in any of your roles, but maybe specifically as the ambassador or the permanent representative, the U.S. permanent representative to NATO? How is energy a tool of competition that maybe can be shaped and used to exploit or disadvantage adversary systems, including against us, if people are using it against us?
Well, it was very important at NATO. It was one of the areas that our military was very keen to look at, especially with the Russian gas and oil providing for Europe,
Right.
and seeing what a hold Russia had on Europe and especially Ukraine. And we had one of the meetings of all of the ambassadors called the Council. Fatih Birol came from the IEA to talk about energy supply today, where it was coming from, what the geopolitical risks were. And he said, back in 2018, he said, America is going to be the largest producer of energy in the world, more than Russia, more than Saudi Arabia. It will be America. He said that. And he saw, of course, as you mentioned right off the bat, fracking changed the whole scene for our capabilities in America to produce, and to produce when people thought that the wells were dry.
Right.
But then fracking brought everything back. And he was projecting that already. So I think the fact that we have that capability is a strength. Secondly, though, I think everyone in NATO knows that we are the country that will assess a risk and then deter against that risk. So it was America that came forward in 2018 and said China is the potential adversary that we must deter for 10 years. And our allies looked around and said, what? China? Oh, why would we do that? But then we started showing all of the evidence of what China was doing, the Belt and Road Initiative, the predatory loans, the buildup of all of their assets. And so I think having the strength of the economy that, and I have to say, America's economy is fueled by affordable energy, affordable energy. So we have an economy that is the strongest in the world, and everyone listens to us because they know we will assess the risk and that we have an intel capability to target where the future adversaries might be and begin that buildup. And the Europeans, we're in a different situation right now, very precarious, but we need to understand that if China really is the potential, we need to have the G20 economies together to face a China. And knocking off our allies with so much turmoil right now, I think has to be self-corrected. We've got to get back to saying, if we keep China as the adversary of the future, how are we going to best relate to their assets?
Right.
And the way we do it is by having the G20 economies of the world saying, you stay with the rules-based order, or we will be together to isolate you in your internal politics and your internal strength. And energy is the basis of that strength that we have. And the most important thing we can do right now, after the dust settles on all of the tariff issues, is to get back on exporting LNG to our European allies. For Germany, I mean, we had a 20-year contract in the making when that LNG pause came. And so, you know, it makes our allies think, well, gosh, are we only in 4-year commitments with you, the U.S.? And so we've got to fix that, and we've got to be the source of oil and gas and reliable energy for our allies, because that is our security strength against a rising China.
Is that this was actually one of my questions. You stole one of my questions from a little later in the session. So let me condense it a little bit and see if there's more to tease out there. You and I talked on Horns of a Dilemma a couple times about this exact issue, and so what do you think are the highlights of what has changed over the last 12 months with respect to our ability to provide natural gas to Europe?
Well, we have the natural gas, as both George and Will have said. We have an almost unlimited supply. So what has changed is that we are geared up and ready to go. And Germany is building the receiving facilities for LNG, and some of our Eastern European allies are as well, Poland and Czech Republic, and they want to buy from us. They don't want to, I mean, they know what it's like to be under the gun with Russia. So this is an opportunity that is a no-brainer. And we've got the supply. Now we've got to start building these. Well, we've got to do two things. We've got to build the facilities to send. They've got to have the facilities to receive. But also, we've got to go back to the pipelines and the refineries. You know, the people say, well, we don't need more drill, baby drill. We have to actually get more refinery capacity, but we couldn't even get expansions of refineries in the last administration. They just wouldn't give permits. And then we know what happened with the Keystone XL pipeline, which, you know, we would have had a much stronger relationship with Canada. We have to have a strong relationship with our neighbor with so many miles of border. And and I was told just recently that actually the Keystone XL pipeline is still in place. It just hasn't been connected between the Canadian and the American ones. And I think we ought to put that together and have that capability and be friends with Canada, because it's in our interest to have a neighbor with whom we can deal and that considers us the strongest allies that we could have.
Who would I'll interject real quick. Who would have ever thought that we would be in some kind of soft war with Canada, of all people? I mean, it's kind of like those films where you make jokes about somebody in the Arctic beating up a baby seal or something like that. I mean, the Canadians are not exactly a ruthless enemy. It's crazy, crazy times.
Well, and it's so important for us to have those trade relationships. And, you know, you can't. This is one thing that I said. Somebody asked me once, are you going to write a book? And I said, yes, the book is going to be titled, The Europeans Are Not Like You and Me. And if you think that we can make Europeans into being like Americans, and Canada is in this category, you'll always be disappointed. But they do so much more. Who buys our F-35s? Where do we have our NORAD facility? It's in Canada. Who buys our F-35s? All of our European allies. And 70% of their military spending is on U.S. products.
Right.
We can build our military industrial base with the purchases of our allies unless we are beating them to death and they start saying, well, we're going to do our own nuclear next generation air fighter, which Germany and France are now talking about. And I don't think we should expect our allies to be like us. We are the best. They know we're the best. All we need to do is make sure they still trust us and that our adversaries still fear us.
Well, going back to some of your comments on China, Will, I'd like to pose this actually to you. And I heard a comment, just a brief comment that you made on Bloomberg surveillance, and I was wondering if you could expand on that a little bit. Can you describe to us the difference between, and there may be better terminology, so fix my terminology if it needs fixing, the difference between the US energy ecosystem, Western Europe's energy ecosystem, and China's energy ecosystem? And what are the vulnerabilities in particular of the Chinese energy ecosystem?
Well, U.S. is easy, right? I've kind of talked about that already. We're completely energy independent, and we are a massive energy exporter. So that's the U.S. Europe is completely energy dependent. When the U.S. went from, we basically tripled our oil and liquids production. We doubled our natural gas production during the shale boom. Europe let their production fall by about 40%. And where did they get that excess supply from? From Russia, okay? So they went from being very modestly dependent on Russia for their energy to hyper dependent on Russia for their energy. So that's basically Europe today. Now Europe's gone, as a result of that, they've tried to have this massive transition into the energy transition of wind and solar. The only problem is if you look at a map and you look at a weather, kind of history of weather, it's pretty far north, and it has a lot of clouds, and it's not super windy in most places, and so while the U.S.
Except for where it's hard to build.
Except for it's very hard to build. Offshore UK is actually a pretty good place. It's just so expensive it may never get built. But they and it is an interesting thing about wind and solar. The U.S. is amazingly well endowed with wind and solar resource, right? Much better. You put a solar panel in the southwestern United States, you put that same solar panel in Germany, you're going to get 2.5 times more electricity out of it in southwestern United States. So there are places where it makes a lot of sense in the U.S. where it does in Europe. But Europe is dependent both for their hydrocarbons, but also for their wind and solar. Not only do they not have very good resource, but they don't produce many of the panels. They produce some of the wind turbines, but the solar panels they don't. China is really in a bad predicament. China imports, they use about 16.5, 17 million barrels a day. They import about 2/3 of that oil. They use about 40 BCF a day of gas. They import about 40% of that. So China is massively dependent, and within China there's a small little strait, the Strait of Malacca, that's kind of between Singapore and Malaysia right there, and the vast majority of their hydrocarbons coming through that strait. It's actually very easy for the U.S. military to cut that off, right? And so because they import so much, the only form of energy China has in abundance is coal. Yeah. And it's why, they have gone all in on coal, and then they've gone all in on wind and solar. And wind and solar for them, it was a technology that, they could develop. They didn't have to depend on was it deposited or not on their continent. Right. And they have, and while they're the most energy dependent nation in the world, especially from a superpower standpoint, they realized that vulnerability 20 years ago, and they went all in on the energy transition and on electric vehicles. Yeah. And if you say, well, why, boy, everybody talks about, oh, China's so great with electric vehicles. Well, the worst thing for the environment is every time China sells a new electric vehicle, right, because it's powered with coal,
Right.
and which is about 2.5 times more polluting, greenhouse gases in an internal combustion engine car. And so, but China said, okay, the coal's going to be our bridge to the future, and we're going to go all in on wind and solar and nuclear. And on wind and solar, they said, well, the problem with wind and solar is there's kind of 3 components to making it work. You got to have the minerals. So you got to mine things like copper and lithium and cobalt and zinc and all these other things, silicon. And then you got to refine it and process it. And then you've got to run those refined products or refined minerals through a manufacturing facility and make actually wind turbines or solar panels or lithium-ion batteries. China set out 20 years ago, realizing their energy vulnerabilities, and said, we're going to go around the world. We're going to tie up the world's supply of these critical minerals. We're going to build the ones we can't tie up. We're going to build the refining capacity in China, and we're going to import those minerals. And then we're going to build the manufacturing out. Yeah. And so when you look at it globally, what China's done is they've locked up on the critical minerals between 30 and 60%, global supply dominance on the minerals, between 40 and 80% on the refining and processing. And things like nickel that you need for things like batteries, while they may only control 5 or 6% of the supply, they control like 65% of the refining. So they control 2/3 of the world's nickel supply. So they've done that in manufacturing. They control 60% of the global supply of wind turbines, 75% of solar panels, 85% of lithium-ion batteries. So think about China as the super OPEC plus of renewables. That's what China is. And it's one country. OPEC is like 14 or 15 countries for oil. And so their ability, their grip on the world, and as the West has so foolishly just lunged into this wind and solar transition, what we don't realize is we're going from trying to move ourselves from this position of energy independence to energy dependence again, right? Because we're not building the mining, we're not building the processing, the refining, and we're not building the manufacturing.
Right.
And so that's the lay of the land. It's why we have to be incredibly intentional. And by the way, they're doing the same thing with nuclear, which is a country we have got to get serious about. It's
including their nuclear weapons.
Well, both, but I'm saying for energy is we can leapfrog China with nuclear. Okay, we will never catch them in wind, solar, and lithium-ion batteries and electric vehicles. They're too far ahead. They will keep getting better. They've locked up a lot of the supply. We shouldn't even try, in my opinion. But with nuclear, very different. Much more simple supply chain.
Right.
Got to worry about kind of one very critical mineral. Got to get some others. Copper still matters and all that. But it's uranium, and we can actually own that, and we can leapfrog the Chinese.
Well, let me leap forward to.
And by the way, we have this window, if you will, of opportunity.
That actually was my next question.
Okay.
Was you've spoken about? I've heard you speak about a window of opportunity. So can you describe that, and how would you use it?
Yeah. So for oil, we may be able to increase production another 1 million or 2 million barrels a day. We may be able to hold that flat for 5 or 10 years. But just like oil started declining in the late 70s in the United States and went into terminal decline until the shale revolution happened almost 40 years later, oil will go into decline again. And I can tell you there's not another shale revolution that's going to happen in the U.S., okay?
Yeah.
So we have this window of maybe somewhere between, if you look at current prices for oil, we've got about an inventory, depending on the basin, of 10 to 12, some basins even a lot less, 4 or 5 years, up to maybe 10 to 12 years. Okay, at current commodity prices. You raise prices to $90 a barrel, which is still very cheap, by the way, and that maybe elongate that 4 or 5 more years. We got this window for transportation where we can maintain U.S. dominance and independence before we go into terminal decline. Okay, again, natural gas, very different story. We've got probably a 70 or 80 year supply of natural gas, and by the time that runs out, we'll have fusion, and none of it's going to matter, okay? So we've got, but at these prices, we don't have that supply. We've got maybe a 10 or 15 year supply of natural gas. Now, the beautiful part about gas is it's the only major product in the world, where in the U.S. it sells for 1/3 to 1/4 what it sells in the rest of the world for, because we have so much of it. And today, before we have all this LNG, it's hard to get it out. So there's two different markets. Oil's not that way, right? Gas is. So we got this window, if you will, of I'm going to call it 10 to 20 years, where America can maintain our energy dominance, our energy independence, while we build out the energy system of the future, which has got to be anchored around nuclear, electrification of transportation. And a lot of my friends, especially Republican friends, don't like to hear me say that. My friends in the oil and gas business hate to hear me say that. But really, electrification of transportation gets us off of oil. And our oil is going to run out. So we're going to have to electrify cars at some point. We may as well get on it today and export that oil to many countries that don't have the gas or the wind or the solar that can electrify. They're going to need that petroleum, and we can power our transportation, at least through light vehicles, through electricity, and we can export, and it'll be a massive source of income and very soft power for the United States globally. So that's the window that I talk about. And if we squander it, we're going to be right back where we were when, before the shale revolution happened, where, we're kind of waking up every morning deciding, and instead of deciding what does Saudi want us to do or Iran or Iraq want us to do, what does China want us to do? We will have to depend on China for our energy.
So I'll ask one more question, the same question or a couple of questions to each of our panelists, and we'll turn it over for 10 or 15 minutes to the audience for Q&A. George, so starting with you, and this is for everybody. I'll ask the question once.
So you let me screw it up first so they can repair it later.
So given this window of opportunity, what are the things that should be at the forefront of our minds in terms of domestic energy policy and foreign policy in the next 10 years, and why? Or if there are things that we have missed here, things that I have missed here, what are some other important questions that we should be asking at this time that should guide us?
Okay, so I want to come back to Europe with that. They always say in this country that look at where Europe is because we're going to be there eventually, or look at where California is, the country's going to follow that eventually. And I say heck no to both those things. You look at Angela Merkel, and when she left office, she was Chancellor of Germany for about 12 years, something like that. Wow. And everybody thought she was like the preeminent leader of Germany in the modern era. And now if you look back with hindsight, after she's been out of power for roughly 8 or 9 years, she really got everything wrong. I mean, she cozied up to the Russians. They just deep sixed their last nuclear power plants in that country. So
and reopened coal.
Yeah, exactly. So just about everything they could have gotten wrong, they did, especially on energy policy. And we do not want to follow the Europeans. Nuclear is really the key to the future in terms of electrification, and our country's finally waking up to that. But the problem is the permitting process and the approval process and the regulatory process is so extended. We're not going to have more nuclear power in this country for at least another 8 or 9 years minimum.
Way longer.
And yeah, it's probably longer than that. He's right. And you look at, we finally got an administration that's conducive to that, but they can't really hit the fast forward button. It's not going to work. And people say, well, what kinds of energy do we need in this country to stay strong from a security standpoint as well as a quality of life standpoint? And the answer is everything.
Yeah.
We need everything. We need wind and solar. They're really not economically viable without extensive subsidies, which is the dirty secret that nobody on the green far left will tell you. One thing you didn't know too, because everybody thinks Texas, they think oil, old men in Texas and all this. The reality is we are triple the size of the next nearest state in terms of wind power.
Yeah.
We generate tons of wind power.
And we become the largest solar producer in the U.S. this year.
Exactly. I think California's trying to catch us on both, but they're not going to. So we need everything. We need hydro. We need solar. We need wind. We need oil and gas. We need everything. And hopefully fusion will come along and rescue us from all these fossil fuels that are evaporating. And then also, hopefully we'll build enough nuclear plants to, they say, we make fun of the French often, the joke is that French or I shouldn't say this, but I'm going to say it anyway because I'm not a politician. I don't have to worry about somebody coming back at me. Cheese-eating surrender monkeys. But one thing the French did get right is they built a ton of nuclear power plants. They really nailed that one, and we should follow their example on that. So I'll be quiet and let somebody else take over.
Well, just as a thought, and this may be common knowledge here in this room, but consider when we think about the future of nuclear, and we can all discuss, we all know the dangers, et cetera, but we
Dangers are far overrated.
Right.
You look
We
at the safety record in this
containerized,
country.
if you think of this in Department of Defense, in the Navy,
Submarines.
less than 15 years after kind of discovering nuclear power, we containerized it and put it on aircraft carriers and submarines, and we have operated without incident. It's incredible. It's really incredible. It can be it can be done very, very
even
safely.
in the history of the world, you look at the 3 major nuclear accidents, and fewer people died collectively in those 3 major accidents than die every day in the world because of people having to burn wood and dung in their home and carcinogens that causes and all the disease. 4 million people die a year because they don't have access to natural gas or petroleum, right? And but can I make a couple kind of follow-up?
Yeah, no, sure. And then why don't we'll close with Senator Hutchison, then we'll go to the Q&A.
Because you think about the energy transit. Like, everybody loves to talk about this term energy transition, and it's really such a misnomer because there's never been an energy transition in the history of the world. Okay, today we use more of all forms of energy than we've ever used before. Okay, and when you think about so really it's energy additions. What we've done is every 30, 40 years comes a need for a new form of energy to be introduced to society because we don't have enough of all the prior forms because populations keep going, economic activity keeps going. And so if you think about it, you go through the major energy transitions that we've had. Coal was the really first big one because we used to use basically wood and dung and a little bit of whale oil, until coal came along in the 1840s and it really kicked off the Industrial Revolution. And 50 years later, coal hit about 35% market share, okay? Oil started getting used in the early 1900s with the invention of the automobile, and 50 years later had about 25% market share. Natural gas started getting used in the 30s with the invention of the gas turbine, and 50 years later had about 20% market share, okay? And then nuclear in the 60s, 30 years later had about 6% market share. It peaked there, and then the oil companies kind of ran a massive campaign to put nuclear out of business, and they were successful. And then the next one was wind and solar, and that's about 15 years into it right now. Okay, we're about 15 years into all out on wind and solar, and we're at about 7%, okay? And we're spending trillions of dollars a year on this stuff, and we're at 7%, 15 years into it. The most aggressive estimates, right, by 2050, everybody talks about net zero by 2050. Go find the most aggressive estimate out there. Wind and solar may make up 35% of global energy by then, okay? And
Don't bet that way.
Yeah, and so you just have to realize these things take a really, 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 really long time, and you need all forms, and you got to be strategic about it. You got to think about where your competitive advantages are. You got to think about the economics, and the best thing for democracy, the best thing for human flourishing in the world is for America to unleash our domestic energy, keep prices low, keep energy supplies abundant and consistent where people can access them. And that's how we export democracy and safety around the world. That's how we empower our allies and don't alienate our allies. And that's how we beat, candidly, our greatest competitor in the world, which is China. So
Senator Hutchison, last word before we go to Q&A. What do you think should be at the forefront of our minds for the next 10 years? Or what's a question we should have posed up here and did not?
I think we have covered it, and I agree with everything that George and Will said. I would say that what we're doing right here at UT is exactly the right policies, all of the above. People who think that we can just go to wind and solar, even though Texas is the leader in wind and solar, as you said, and it's correct. What we're doing here is all of the above, and we're doing the research to make hydrogen capable of being done. We need to make it affordable. We've got the research being done here on hydrogen, and it's really showing a lot of promise, just like electricity, that you can have a hydrogen tank in your garage and fuel your car with it. But it's expensive. We are doing battery research. lithium is, Fred Beach, who's here, mentioned in an interview that we had a couple of, for the UT Leadership Council, he said lithium is, we're not even going to need it in 10 years because we're going to have the other forms of minerals that are going to make the batteries that are essential for wind and solar. We've got to have bigger, more resilient batteries, and we're doing that research right here at UT to find those new minerals that will be the propellant for the wind and solar. But I want America to be America again. I want America to be the best, to be the leader and recognized as the leader, and to do it in a way where, people love Americans because we are gregarious and we're giving, we are philanthropic, and we've been the shining city on the hill. And I want us to go back to doing all the things right, sharing and being a good neighbor, a good ally, and a formidable enemy.
If I can share with you the way I've been putting this recently to some of our students is that America may not be always, or America may not always do what is exceptional, but American exceptionalism is a real thing, and I've touched it, and I've participated in it, and I've been there and seen it. And you have too, perhaps especially with NATO. So it's a real thing, and we ought to embrace it and aspire to the best of that. So let's turn it to Q&A now, and we'll probably have time for about, depending on the length of the question, 3 or 4 questions.
All right. Okay. I'm going to squeeze through here. Yeah, you just start talking.
Hello, good afternoon, and thank you for your valuable insight and words. I was just wondering, I read a couple of articles that are that are relatively new, 2020 and 2024, that suggest the nationalization of the fossil fuel industry to contribute or make a more effective this sector, or how could I put it, enable the transition. What are your thoughts about this, nationalize the fossil fuel industry?
Nationalizing the fossil fuel industry.
Because why? I'm sorry, what was the premise of that?
Because they talk about the ineffectiveness of the industry, and that this contributes to they are not enabling the transition to clean energy. So I know this is extreme. So we have seen examples in some countries like Mexico, in which slowly both industries, the oil and gas and the electricity industry, are shifting towards nationalizing it. So I was wondering, what are your thoughts?
Well, why don't you take that one, Will?
Well, I would say just in general, in my mind, nationalizing any industry is a horrible idea. It doesn't really work. If you look at the most inefficient industries or organizations, companies, government in the world, are things that have been nationalized. So nationalizing just doesn't work for anything. If the premise, though, is by nationalizing it, we can start to phase it out. Maybe that's what the premise, so we can move into the world of clean energy. What I'd say is that's economic suicide, and it's political suicide, it's military suicide. There'd be nothing worse for our country than to actually do that. First of all, I'll tell you, the Chinese aren't doing that. The Russians aren't doing that. The Iranians aren't doing that. None of our adversaries are doing that. They're using the cheapest form of energy they can get, right, and what they have access to. Okay, right. And so there's no rational reason why we would do that. And by the way, if America doesn't produce it, let's just say we shut in all of our wells in the United States. Society would collapse, right? we would go out and we'd try to buy that energy from Russia and Venezuela and Iran and Iraq. It's not the fact, like you can't change people's consumption patterns per se, okay? And one of the arguments we've tried to make is in America, if you actually care about ESG, in America, we produce hydrocarbons, putting out about half the greenhouse gases that the rest of the world does, okay? So our hydrocarbons, which the world's gonna use no matter what, they're either gonna get them from countries like the US and Europe that care about ESG, or they're gonna get them from ones that don't. So by incentivizing and producing hydrocarbons in America, you get the cleanest hydrocarbons in the world. You get the most socially responsible hydrocarbons in the world in terms of, if you look at, take something like Freedom House does a great job of scoring countries, their social scores. And you look at the other countries that would pick up that production, right. They would be countries that were 4 or 5 times worse to their people, child labor laws, women labor laws, equal pay for equal work, the workplace standards. It's horrible where that would come from. And so that's what people don't really, lots of people got on this bandwagon about ESG, let's transition. It's just not, it's not going to happen, and it's irresponsible, I think, to even think about trying to do that.
Can I add something real briefly? So President Ronald Reagan famously said, the scariest 8 words in the English language are, I'm from the government, I'm here to help. And you look at Amtrak, you look at the post office. I think the only thing, in my humble opinion, the government gets right, I think a lot of Texans would agree with me, is the U.S. military. And I would argue the 2 strongest forces in the history of the world, number 2 is the U.S. military, number 1 is the U.S. private sector and the U.S. business community. And I'm all for unleashing the business community and getting it out of their way, because I think the transition will happen a lot faster if we turn them loose.
One more question. Yes, sir.
Yeah, my name's Tim Tarver. I'm with Exceed Energy. I was just curious. I've been in the oil and gas business for 40 years. I've drilled from the Arctic Circle to Venezuela, from Beverly Hills to New York. One of the things that I didn't hear is the geothermal energy. I'm part of the reason why we became so efficient drilling horizontal wells. Taking the Permian Basin, for an example, being able to drill the 35,000-foot well in 15 days, or the Haynesville. And with Texas being such a hotbed of energy, we have the capabilities of putting geothermal from East Texas all the way to South Texas, all along our border, and even just right outside of the city. There's by Fayetteville power plant, and some of those wells are 400 degrees Fahrenheit. And I haven't heard anything from you guys about geothermal, and I just thought, being from oil and gas guys, with a bunch of the consolidation that's been happening in the oil and gas industry, why don't we think about doing the geothermal? And I don't agree with her as far as the Claudia Sheinbaum is looking after the geothermal industry. They're changing over and making that privatized for CFE. They just passed that law here a few days ago. And I just wanted to see what you guys thought about maybe the transition from some of the oil and gas into geothermal, because it's directly related.
Will, should
Sure. I mean, we're all over that.
I agree that we ought to be looking at it, but I don't know. We're doing it with water now, going deep, miles down to the hot water sources, salt water, turning it into potable water. But
I think
geothermal.
I think it's the industry's just had to kind of get up the learning curve on it, right? I don't think it's the holy grail, if you will. There's a lot we don't understand about, how once we start running lots of water down there, is there going to be a cooling effect of the reservoirs? And you look at the turbines and how all these systems are configured. I mean, they're pretty finely tuned. And but look, I think geothermal's day is coming. I think it is going to increasingly be a source of energy in certain parts of the country for the United States. And I think there's been a lot of dollars. I mean, the oil and gas industry's put a lot of money trying to figure it out, because it's the same technology, right? So you're dead on. I mean, I think it's interesting. I hope it's going to be bigger than I actually think it will be, but it could be.
Maybe one more question.
Hey guys, thanks. I'm Tom Myers. I'm the Energy Program Manager for the Texas Army National Guard. Will, I really liked your comment about a window. and one is your hot take on your guidance or how you see the automotive industry for the U.S. navigating that window. The way I see it, they do have a window. There's strong justification to continue to manufacture internal combustion engines. The U.S. adoption for EVs is pretty slow. China's flooded the market with cheap, very, very, very good technology. They exported more vehicles than General Motors produced. General Motors exports 30% of General Motors revenue goes to China, or production goes to China. 16% of Ford goes to China. Without an EV offering, they're not competitive in that market, and that market is bigger than Europe and the US combined. So they're stuck producing profitable ICE vehicles for a short duration, but the future is electrification to be competitive in markets abroad, to push regional power and have that soft influence. We're negating our ability to compete in those markets. What do?
Well, if you go back for the last 6 or 7 years, like almost 100% of the R&D budgets for the global auto manufacturers has been focused on electric vehicles, right? The penetration in China's obviously been massive, and that was really out of necessity. I mean, they were killing their cities were so dirty, the air quality was so bad that people were literally like dying and sick all the time. And so they had to basically quit burning. They could instead of running them on gasoline, they could run them on electricity that they made with coal, but they'd put the coal plant 1,000 kilometers outside of the city and just make it, and the air out there is really bad, but in the city, right? So that's why China's done it. They haven't done it because they love the environment. But the problem is China identifies major industries that it wants to own. And then it develops a long-term plan. China is great at long-term planning, something we're not very good at in the United States. And then they flood the zone in terms with money, and the government massively subsidizes it. So right now, it's not even a fair game. Like the amount of subsidies have come from the Chinese government to effectively build out the whole ecosystem of electric vehicles in China is extraordinary. And people love to, everybody's like, hey, let's repeal the IRA. I mean, that's a big call right now. Let's repeal the IRA. And personally, I think our government's way too big. I think we spend way too much money that we don't have. And I think we're going to put a massive, tax on our kids and our grandkids and our great-grandkids. That's a separate issue. IRA, though, it's real simple. Oil and gas loves to say, and by the way, 90% of what we do is oil and gas, okay? So I'm an oil and gas guy, the kind of metals and that other stuff. Oil and gas has been one of the biggest recipients of government handouts in the history of U.S. capitalism, okay? The shale revolution wouldn't have come about had it not have been for things like Section 29 tax credits that kicked off the tight basin gas and the coal bed methane gas back in the 80s and the 90s. We have this depletion allowance. We get to expense 2x what we spend on things. So governments always interfere to some degree in markets. And right now, the U.S. is on the verge of losing forever the automobile industry if we don't get into high gear and help American companies, taking away that subsidy for getting people into electric vehicles. I hate subsidies, but if you don't do it, American automobile manufacturing is gone forever because a lot of the rest of the world's moving to EVs, and we're going to be left out. So I'm in this case, I'm a big believer that America needs to double down in EVs. That's going to hurt oil consumption at home. It's the right answer for our country long term. It may be the wrong answer for my industry. It's the right answer for our country long term.
And to follow up on that briefly from a historical standpoint, because what's so interesting about these things is there's a history to all of it, and it involves people. And the reason the oil and gas industry has such incredible tax breaks and allowances and depletion and everything else is because Sam Rayburn was the Speaker of the U.S. House for a very long time, and Lyndon Johnson was the Majority Leader of the Senate, and they ramrodded that through the Congress, and it's still here today. It's dug in like a tick. You can't get it out.
Right. But we wouldn't have had the shale revolution had it not been for that, right? And
Yep.
so how much is that worth? It may look expensive on the
lot.
front end, but
Worth
I'd
every
argue
penny.
it was an incredible investment. Yep.
Do you think that?
Well, we'll wrap up here. Feel free to connect after we wrap up. But all of our panelists traveled a long way. None of them are Austin residents. So thank you for traveling here for this event. Senator Hutchison, thank you so much for asking us to participate in your panel. And thank you for the great work that the Energy Center has been doing, and we look forward to its growth in the coming years.
Well, we look forward to continuing to work with the Clements Center and talk about the importance of energy security. It is essential, and we love working with Clements. So we're going to keep doing that. And also, never forget, we are doing all of the above.
Yes.
Oil and gas has been our historical bread and butter, but we are also doing all of the other things that are so exciting. But we got to be first and the most resilient to stay on top.
Great. Well, thanks. I'll turn it over to who it is. All right.